She had built a $1 billion empire before her 30th birthday, survived boardrooms full of men who wanted her to fail, and never once let anyone see her hands shake. But standing in a hotel corridor screaming her daughter's name into the emptiness, Victoria Ashford was just a mother who couldn't find her child. Somewhere in that building, a man who had pulled living people out of burning buildings in 3 different war zones was quietly explaining how elevator cables worked to a 6-year-old girl who hadn't spoken to a stranger in 14 months. Neither of them knew it yet, but that afternoon was going to change everything. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Stories like this one don't come around often, and I'd hate for you to catch only half of it. Drop a like if you're already feeling this, and leave a comment below telling me what city and country you're watching from. I genuinely want to see how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The elevator had been malfunctioning since Tuesday. That was the word the hotel's facilities manager had used when he called the service company at 6:30 in the morning, malfunctioning, which was the polished, liability-conscious way of saying that the main service elevator inside the Alderton Grand Hotel had been dropping between floors without warning, shuddering and stalling, and generally behaving in a way that made the union kitchen staff refuse to use it after the 3rd incident. The hotel's general manager, a thin, perpetually damp-looking man named Gerald Holt, had approved the emergency repair call because he had no choice. The Ashford Capital Investors Summit was scheduled to begin in the ballroom at 11. There would be 240 people in that building by noon, including 6 of the largest institutional investors in North America, a pair of sitting senators whose names Gerald could not afford to see in a negative news headline, and Victoria Ashford herself. Gerald was deeply committed to nothing going wrong, which was why, at 7:15 in the morning, Ethan Cross was already inside the service corridor behind the elevator bank on the 4th floor, crouched beneath a panel he'd removed from the wall, with a flashlight in one hand and the kind of expression on his face that mechanics get when they find something that should have been fixed 6 months ago and wasn't. "Talk to me," said his work partner, Danny Reyes, standing behind him in the corridor, holding a clipboard he hadn't written anything on yet. "Worn cable guide on the secondary brake housing," Ethan said. "Somebody replaced the main tensioner but didn't check what was underneath it. The guide's been grinding since probably February. Can we fix it before noon?" Ethan sat back on his heels and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was a big man, not enormous, but the kind of physical presence that a corridor noticed. Broad through the shoulders, with hands that looked built for difficult work, and a face that had been weathered past its years without becoming hard. There was a calm to him that read differently depending on who was looking. To some people it came across as easygoing. To people who'd been around genuine discipline, it read as something that had been trained into the body over a long time. "Yeah," he said, "but it'll take most of the morning. I need the replacement housing and about 3 hours of quiet." Danny made a sound that wasn't quite optimistic. "Gerald's going to check in every 45 minutes. "Then Gerald's going to watch me work," Ethan said, and turned back to the panel. Oh, he had been doing this for 4 years. Before that, there were 11 years he didn't talk about much. Not because he was ashamed of them, but because there was no clean way to explain what they contained to someone who hadn't been there. The Navy hadn't broken him. The SEAL program hadn't broken him. 3 combat deployments, 2 classified extraction operations in places that don't appear on the route anyone flies over, and 1 incident in a coastal city. He was still not legally permitted to name, hadn't broken him either. He had come home from all of it with most of himself intact, quieter than he'd left, and carrying a weight in the chest that never fully lifted, but intact. What had finally cracked him open was a hospital room in Chicago at 2 in the morning, 4 years ago, when a nurse he'd never met before came into the waiting area where he was sitting and told him that his wife, Maya, had not survived the surgery. Her name was Maya Cross, née Sorensen, and she had been 33 years old, and she had been 7 months pregnant with what would have been their second child, and she had gone into the hospital at 11 in the evening for what the doctors initially described as a precautionary assessment of some concerning readings her OB had flagged that afternoon. He had not been allowed to see her before she went in. He had been sitting in a waiting room chair for 3 hours when the nurse came out, and he had watched the nurse's face before she opened her mouth, and he had already known. Ethan did not remember the drive home. He remembered standing in the doorway of his daughter's bedroom at 3 in the morning, watching her sleep in the blue-gray dark, and thinking that he could not afford to stop functioning. That was exactly how the thought had arrived, not as grief or love or resolve, but as a cold mechanical certainty. He could not stop. She was 5 years old and asleep, and she needed him to still be there in the morning. He had been there in the morning. He had been there every morning since. Emma Cross was 6 now, and she was the most opinionated person Ethan had ever met, which, given his professional history, was a meaningful statement. She had her mother's dark curly hair and her mother's habit of tilting her head sideways when she was deciding whether to trust something you'd just told her. She had Ethan's stubbornness, and he was fairly sure Ethan's ability to read a room. She noticed things that other kids her age walked past without blinking. She was also currently at school, which meant Ethan's mind was on the cable housing and not on the small perpetual background worry that occupied a dedicated corner of his attention during every working hour. He had a system. He had always operated with systems. The military had reinforced a natural tendency he'd had since childhood to build structures around uncertainty, to impose order on situations that didn't offer any. His current system involved a very reliable neighbor named Donna, who picked Emma up from school on days he was running late, a rigid routine of dinner at 6 and bath at 7, and stories until Emma decided she was finished, and a calendar on his phone that he updated with the same seriousness he'd once given to mission timetables. It was not a perfect life. It was sometimes a lonely one, but it was functional, and Emma was happy, and on most days that felt like enough. He was 40 minutes into the cable housing repair when he first heard the sound. It was faint, not a cry, not a voice, just a shuffle of feet on the concrete floor of the service corridor about 20 feet further down toward the utility access doors. Ethan didn't stop working immediately. The service corridors in a hotel this size carried noise from half a dozen sources: kitchen staff, maintenance routes, loading dock foot traffic. He cataloged the sound and kept his hands on the housing. Then he heard it again, and this time he placed it differently. The rhythm of the footsteps was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate, with the kind of careful weight distribution that somebody used when they were trying not to be heard. That wasn't a kitchen worker cutting through on a shortcut. Kitchen workers moved fast and didn't care who heard them. Ethan set down his wrench and stood up. The girl was standing near the junction of 2 corridors about 15 feet from the utility door, pressed against the wall in the shadows between 2 banks of electrical conduit. She was small, younger than Emma, maybe, or close to the same age, wearing a pale blue dress that looked expensive and completely wrong for a concrete service corridor. Her dark hair was pulled back on one side with a clip shaped like a butterfly, and the other side had come loose. She wasn't crying. She was just standing very still, in the particular way that children stand when they've gone somewhere they weren't supposed to go and are now trying to decide if standing still will make the situation better. She looked at him when he appeared around the corner. He stopped. He didn't crouch down immediately, didn't rush toward her with the big, reassuring adult energy that kids in that state tended to find more alarming than helpful. He just stopped moving and stood where he was, about 12 feet away, and looked at her the same way she was looking at him. "Hey," he said. She didn't answer. "I'm Ethan. I'm fixing the elevator." He gestured back down the corridor with his thumb. "You can hear it if you listen. That clicking sound. That's the part I need to replace." She didn't say anything, but she tilted her head. She could hear it. "You're not in trouble," he said. "I'm not going to go get anybody. I just want to make sure you're okay." She watched him with very careful eyes. Ethan sat down on the floor, just cross-legged on the concrete because he was too tall, and that was the most neutral thing he could do with his height at that moment. He picked up the small flashlight he'd clipped to his belt and clicked it on, shining it at the conduit above them. "These pipes," he said conversationally, not looking at her, "run the electrical circuits for this whole floor, 13 separate circuits. The hotel thinks it's 12, but they miscounted when they renovated in 2019. He clicked the light off. "I found the extra one on a job 2 years ago. Never told Gerald." Silence. Then, the faint sound of a small foot shifting on concrete. He didn't look up. "The elevator I'm fixing," he continued, "has a secondary brake system that's supposed to catch if the main one fails. Most people don't know it's there. They step into an elevator and they just trust it, right? They don't think about what's holding them up." He set the flashlight down. "But there are about 6 different systems working every single time that door closes. Cable tension, brake housing, counterweight, Speed governor. If any one of them isn't right, you feel it. The elevator tells you something's wrong before anything actually goes wrong. She had moved closer. Not much, 3 feet maybe, but she was out of the shadows now, and she was looking at the conduit above them. It's like that with a lot of things, Ethan said. They give you a warning first. You just have to know how to listen. A pause. My mom is upstairs. Her voice was small but clear, the way a child's voice sounds when they haven't used it much lately, and are slightly surprised it still works. Ethan didn't react like it was a miracle. He just nodded. In the ballroom? A very slight hesitation. Then, there were a lot of people. They were all talking really loud. Yeah, he said. Hotel ballrooms are rough. Everybody talking at once. Nobody really listening to anybody. He paused. You needed some quiet. She looked at him. You're not going to say I shouldn't have gone by myself? You found a safe corridor and stood against a wall, he said. You didn't go outside. You didn't hide somewhere you couldn't be seen. You did okay. Something shifted in her face. Not a smile yet, but the thing that comes just before one. What's your name? He asked. Lily. Lily. He nodded like that was useful information. I have a daughter named Emma. She's 6. I'm 6. Yeah, she's in 1st grade. Me too. Lily took another step closer, looking at the tools spread on the floor beside him. What's that one? He picked it up. Cable tension gauge. Tells me how much stress a cable is under without me having to take it apart to check. How does it know? Measures resistance. The tighter the cable, the more it pushes back against the gauge. He handed it to her, carefully, handle first. You can hold it. It won't break. She turned it over in her hands, examining it with the focused attention that kids give to objects they've been trusted with. Her fingers were small and careful. Do you fix elevators every day? She asked. Not every day. Sometimes escalators, freight lifts, anything that moves people or things between floors, basically. Did you always do that? He considered the question honestly. No, I did something else before. What? I was in the Navy. She processed this. Did you drive boats? Sometimes. Mostly I did other things. Like what? He looked at her for a moment. 6 years old, small butterfly clip half falling out of her hair, holding a cable tension gauge like it was something precious. I helped people who were stuck get unstuck, he said, in places where it was hard to get to them. She seemed to find this satisfying. She handed the gauge back to him. Is that why you're not scared of anything? The question caught him off guard in a way that almost nothing managed to do anymore. He looked at her. Who said I'm not scared of anything? You sat down on the dirty floor, she said, with the particular logic of a 6-year-old. And you talked about pipes like it was normal. Scared people don't do that. Ethan was quiet for a moment. I'm scared of plenty of things, he said. I'm scared something will happen to my daughter when I'm not there. I'm scared I'll get something wrong that I can't fix. He set the gauge back down. Being scared doesn't mean you stop moving. You just move anyway. Lily looked at him with an expression that was too old for her face. My mom says stuff like that, she said, but she says it like she's reading it. You say it like it's just true. Ethan didn't have an answer for that. He picked up his wrench and turned back toward the panel. You want to hand me things while I work? He asked. She crouched down beside the toolbox. Which one first? She was with him for 22 minutes. He knew the time because he'd checked his watch when she first appeared. Old habit, the instinct to timestamp things. And he checked it again when he heard the sound of running footsteps at the far end of the corridor, the sharp-heeled, authoritative stride of someone moving fast toward something that mattered. In those 22 minutes, Lily had handed him 4 different tools in the right order without being asked twice, had learned the difference between a standard and a torque wrench, had asked 6 questions about the counterweight system that were genuinely good questions, and had told him, in a voice that got steadily less careful and more natural as the minutes passed, that she liked the sound the tools made and that she didn't really like parties, but she didn't want to hurt her mother's feelings by saying so. She had laughed once. It was a real laugh, small and sudden, at something he said about Gerald. He was finishing the secondary housing bolt when the footsteps stopped and he looked up. The woman in the corridor entrance was wearing a charcoal blazer and had the kind of composure that had clearly been assembled from broken pieces very recently, eyes sharp and wild beneath a controlled expression, one hand pressed flat against the doorframe like she needed the wall to be still. She was 30, maybe. Dark-haired, striking in the way that came from intensity rather than anything softer, and she was staring at Lily with an expression that Ethan recognized immediately because he had worn it himself once, in a hospital waiting room, when he'd understood in the space of a breath that the worst thing had not happened but had been within reach. Lily stood up straight. "Mom," she said in a clear, confident voice. "This is Ethan. He's fixing the elevator. He was in the Navy and he helped people get unstuck." Victoria Ashford stared at her daughter. Her mouth opened and nothing came out. Ethan got to his feet quietly and stepped back to give the moment whatever space it needed. "She found the corridor about 20 minutes ago," he said. "She wasn't in any danger. She was helping me work." Victoria's eyes moved to him, quick, assessing, the look of someone who processed information fast, and then moved back to her daughter, and she crossed the corridor and went down to one knee on the concrete floor in her blazer and her tailored trousers and pulled Lily against her without saying anything at all. Lily patted her mother's shoulder with the small, systematic pat of a child who was used to being the one to do the comforting. "I told you I was okay," Lily said. "You didn't tell me anything," Victoria said, voice muffled. "You were gone. I left the ballroom because it was loud." Victoria pulled back and looked at her daughter's face. Ethan watched her register something. Whatever it was she saw there, it wasn't only relief. There was something else crossing her face, something much more complicated, that he didn't yet have enough information to read. "You talked to him," Victoria said, very quietly. Lily nodded. "He sat on the floor." Victoria Cross looked up at Ethan Cross over her daughter's head. He was standing against the conduit pipes with his wrench in his hand and grease on his forearms, and he looked back at her without any particular expression. "Thank you," she said. "She was fine," he said. "She's smart. She asked good questions." Victoria stood up slowly, keeping one hand on Lily's shoulder. The composure was back in place, efficiently reassembled, but there was something working beneath it that hadn't been there before, some calculation she was turning over that he didn't quite understand. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Go ahead." "How did you get her to talk to you?" Ethan looked at her for a moment. "I didn't," he said. "I just didn't make her feel like she had to." Victoria Ashford stood in a concrete service corridor with grease on the knee of her $700 trousers and looked at a mechanic who had just said the things she hadn't been able to figure out in 14 months of specialists and strategies and careful approaches in controlled environments. She didn't say anything else. She nodded once, took her daughter's hand, and walked back down the corridor toward the ballroom and the investors and the world she'd built, and Ethan Cross watched them go and then turned back to the elevator panel, because the secondary housing still needed 3 more bolts, and Gerald was going to check in within the hour. He picked up the wrench. Somewhere above him, 240 people were networking and making deals and performing whatever version of themselves made the most professional sense in rooms like that. And a 6-year-old girl who hadn't spoken to a stranger in 14 months was walking back into the noise of it, holding her mother's hand. Ethan Cross tightened the first bolt. He did not think about miracles. He did not think that way. He thought about cable tension and brake housings and the 3 remaining bolts, and the way a system told you something was wrong before anything actually broke, if you knew how to listen. He kept working. Gerald Holt found Ethan at 12:40, which was 20 minutes later than his promised check-in, because the investor lunch had run long, and someone had spilled a full carafe of sparkling water across the table nearest the podium, and Gerald had been required to personally oversee the cleanup in a way that made him feel simultaneously essential and humiliated. He came down the service corridor at a half-jog, tie loosened, and found Ethan reassembling the panel cover with the calm efficiency of a man who had been doing exactly this for the past 4 hours. "Tell me it's fixed," Gerald said. "It's fixed." Gerald exhaled through his nose. "The main elevator?" "Both. I also checked the freight lift on the south side while I was at it. The door seal on the 3rd floor landing is wearing out. You'll want to replace it in the next 6 weeks or the safety sensor's going to start misfiring." Gerald stared at him. "I didn't ask you to check that." "No," Ethan agreed. He snapped the last panel clip into place and stood up, gathering his tools. "You want me to write it up or just leave it?" "Write it up," Gerald said, after a pause that suggested he was calculating whether acknowledging the extra work would somehow obligate him to pay for it.
I'll pass it to maintenance. Ethan zipped his tool bag and didn't say anything else, because Gerald was the kind of man who filled silences with his own anxiety, and there was no reason to help him out of it. He signed the job sheet, took his copy, and walked back down the corridor toward the service exit. Danny was waiting by the truck in the parking structure, eating a sandwich with the focused dedication of someone who had missed breakfast. "How's Gerald?" Danny asked. "Damp," Ethan said. Danny handed him half the sandwich.
Ethan took it and leaned against the truck and ate it standing up, watching the parking structure's exit ramp, where a black SUV had just pulled in with a Ashford Capital placard visible through the windshield. He looked at it for a moment and then looked away. "We've got the Wacker Drive job tomorrow," Danny said. "Freight elevator in the office building, 3-hour window before the tenants start complaining." "I know, 6 a.m. start." "I was going to say 7. The window closes at 9. 6. Danny made a sound that was not agreement but was not argument either, which was the language they had developed over 3 years of working together. Ethan finished the sandwich, checked his phone, no messages from Donna, which meant Emma's pickup had gone fine, and got in the truck. He drove home through the early afternoon traffic thinking about cable tension and whether he'd correctly torqued the secondary housing bolt or whether he should have gone a quarter turn tighter, which was the kind of thing that most mechanics didn't think about after they left a job, but which Ethan's brain refused to let go of until he'd mentally walked back through the whole sequence and confirmed it was right. By the time he'd pulled onto his street, he'd confirmed it was right. He sat in the truck in his driveway for a minute before going inside. The neighborhood was ordinary in the way he'd specifically chosen. 2-story houses with small yards. Enough families that Emma had kids within walking distance. Quiet enough at night that he could hear if something was wrong. He'd bought the house with money. He'd saved carefully over 11 years of military pay and a settlement from a pension arrangement he'd negotiated when he separated. And it was not large and it needed paint on the east-facing eaves, but it was his and it was Emma's, and those were the only 2 things that mattered. He went inside and started making dinner before Emma got home. He did not think about Lily again until that evening, when Emma was in the bath and he was leaning in the bathroom doorway, half watching, half zoned out, and Emma said, "Daddy, did anything happen today?" She asked this most evenings. It was part of their routine. He'd ask about her day first, and she'd give him the full detailed report, and then she'd flip it back to him. She had done this since she was 4.5, and she still expected a real answer, not a summary. "I fixed an elevator," he said. "Was it broken bad?" "Medium. The brake housing was worn out. Somebody had replaced the main part but missed what was underneath." Emma considered this. She was sitting with her knees pulled up, surrounded by 3 rubber ducks she had named Gerald, Patricia, and Steve, for reasons she'd never fully explained. "Did you find it in time?" "Yeah." "Good." She picked up Gerald the duck and examined him. "Anything else?" Ethan was quiet for a second. "I talked to a little girl while I was working," he said. "She was about your age. She'd wandered into the service corridor by herself because the ballroom she was supposed to be in was too loud." Emma looked up at him. "Was she scared?" "I don't think so. I think she was just done with the noise." "Like I get done with the lunchroom sometimes." "Yeah, like that." Emma put Gerald back with the others and looked at the water. "Did you help her?" "I just talked to her," he said. "Showed her some tools. She was smart, asked good questions." "What was her name?" "Lily." Emma nodded slowly, the way she did when she was filing something away. Then she stood up in the tub and held out her arms to be wrapped in a towel, because the conversation was apparently complete. He wrapped her in the towel. She smelled like cheap strawberry shampoo, which was the only kind she would tolerate. He carried her to her room, and she fell asleep faster than usual, and Ethan sat in the kitchen afterward with a cup of coffee that went cold while he stared at the window over the sink and thought about nothing in particular, which was the thing he did when he was actually thinking about something specific but hadn't admitted it yet. Victoria Ashford called at 8:47 that evening. He almost didn't answer. The number was unknown, and he had a policy about unknown numbers after 7 p.m. that was rooted in a brief and unpleasant period a couple of years ago, when a journalist had found his number in connection with a story about a former colleague from his Navy days and had called at 11 p.m. twice before Ethan had made it clear, with the kind of calm that communicated a great deal without saying anything inflammatory, that this would not be happening again. He answered on the 3rd ring. "Is this Ethan Cross?" The voice was even, controlled,
with a slight deliberateness to it that suggested she was used to initiating calls that other people found important. Speaking. This is Victoria Ashford. You repaired the elevator at the Alderton Grand today. Gerald Holt provided me with your company's contact information. A brief pause. I hope that's not an intrusion. Ethan looked at his cold coffee. It's fine. How did you get my direct number? Your company's after-hours line. I explained the situation. The woman I spoke to was very helpful. That would be Danny's wife, Renata, who ran the dispatch line from home on evenings and weekends, and was constitutionally incapable of refusing a request from someone who sounded like they meant it. What can I do for you? He asked. I wanted to call and thank you, Victoria said. Personally, not through Gerald. Another pause, and this one had something different in it, something that was less practiced. What happened today with Lily? I'm not entirely sure what to say about it, to be honest. I'm not usually at a loss for words. You don't have to say anything about it. She hasn't spoken to anyone outside our household since last February, Victoria said. 14 months. We've seen 3 different specialists. I've restructured our entire schedule around managing her environment. Her voice was steady, but the steadiness was the kind that required maintenance. And she talked to you for 20 minutes in a concrete corridor about elevator mechanics. Ethan didn't say anything immediately. I'm not saying I fixed anything, he said carefully. I'm just a guy who was sitting on the floor. I know that. Victoria was quiet for a moment. That's actually why I'm calling. I'd like to buy you a cup of coffee. Not a formal meeting. I understand that's probably not something you're interested in. Just coffee. Tomorrow morning or the morning after, whichever works for you. He thought about saying no. He ran through the reasons to say no. He didn't know this woman. She was clearly someone whose world operated on entirely different terms than his. And the last time he'd let himself get pulled into something that started as a simple conversation, it had taken him 6 months to fully extract himself. Those were reasonable reasons. I've got an early job tomorrow, he said. Thursday morning works. There's a place called Reardon's on Michigan, near the bridge. 7:30. I'll be there, she said. He hung up and looked at the window some more. Whooped up. Reardon's was not a place Victoria Ashford would normally end up. It had 8 stools at a counter, 4 booths with vinyl seats that had been repaired with electrical tape at some point in the mid-90s and never replaced, and a coffee that was extraordinarily good in the way that coffee at unpretentious places sometimes is, brewed in a machine that looked like it weighed 400 pounds and had been there since the Carter administration. The owner, a man named Phil Reardon, who was the grandson of the original Phil Reardon, knew Ethan by name and had his order started by the time he pushed through the door. Victoria was already there when he arrived at 7:28, sitting in the last booth with a cup of coffee she'd clearly just received. She was in a gray blazer this time, no corporate armor, and her hair was down. She looked simultaneously like someone who had made a considered effort to appear less formal, and like someone to whom formality was so deeply wired that abandoning it required active concentration. She looked up when he came in. "You're early," she said. "You're earlier," he said, and sat down across from her. Phil appeared with his coffee without being asked. Victoria looked at the mug, a heavy diner mug, thick white ceramic with a small chip on the handle, and Ethan watched her make a quick decision to say nothing about it. "Thank you for coming," she said. "Sure." She wrapped both hands around her mug. She had the posture of someone who was accustomed to sitting at tables where she had the most power in the room, and he watched her recalibrate that slightly, because this was not that kind of table. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not politely." "Go ahead." When Lily came into the corridor, "What did you actually do, step by step? Because I've had specialists tell me what I need to do, and I've read everything I can find on selective mutism in children, and I've done everything right, and none of it worked. And you spent 20 minutes with her, and something shifted." She looked at him directly. "I'm not looking for a miracle explanation. I just want to understand what actually happened." Ethan thought about it for a moment. "I didn't do anything," he said. She started to say something, and he held up one hand, not in a silencing way, just a slow-down way. "I mean that specifically. I didn't approach her. I didn't reassure her. I didn't try to get her to talk. I saw a kid standing in a corridor looking like she needed the world to back off about 6 inches, so I sat down on the floor and started talking about pipes." Victoria was very still. "I talked about pipes," he said again. "And then I talked about the elevator."
Not to her. I just talked. Because I was there and the information was true, and there was no agenda attached to it, no expectation. He picked up his coffee. Kids know when you want something from them. They know it the same way adults know it, except they haven't learned how to pretend they don't notice yet. Victoria looked at him for a long moment. Every specialist I've worked with has had an approach, she said slowly. A framework, a method. There's always something they're moving her toward. Yeah, you weren't moving her anywhere. I was fixing a break housing. Something shifted in her expression, not quite a smile, more like the involuntary softening that happens when a person hears something true that they'd been trying to figure out how to say. She told me this morning that you have a daughter named Emma, Victoria said. She asked if Emma could come to her birthday party in September. Ethan looked at his coffee. Lily doesn't usually ask for things like that, Victoria said. She doesn't ask about other kids. She's been very internal this past year, very enclosed. She paused. Her father left when she was 4. I don't talk about that because it's not my favorite subject, but I think you should know it's part of the picture. He nodded without making it into more than it was. You don't need to explain your situation to me, he said. I'm not explaining it, she said. I'm giving you context because I think you're someone who does better with context than with a surface version of things. That was an accurate read, and the speed of it was slightly uncomfortable, which was interesting because very few things made him uncomfortable anymore. What do you want from this conversation? He asked. Not rudely, just directly, because she had asked him to be direct and it seemed reasonable to return the courtesy. She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated. Honestly, I'm not sure. I think I wanted to meet the person who sat on a dirty floor and talked about elevator cables, and accidentally did more for my daughter in 20 minutes than I've been able to do in a year. She looked at him. And I think I wanted to see if you were actually as straightforward as you seemed, or if that was something people present in crisis situations. And? You ordered coffee without looking at the menu, sat down without saying sorry for being slightly late, and answered my question without framing it first, she said. So I think you're actually like that. I was 2 minutes early, he said. 2 minutes early is slightly late in my professional life. That sounds exhausting. She laughed, short, real, catching herself slightly by surprise. It is, she said. It genuinely is. Bill refilled their cups without being asked, which was the correct behavior, and they sat with the refills for a moment in a silence that was not uncomfortable. Can I ask you something? Ethan said. Yes. Lily said the ballroom was too loud. What was your read on why she was there in the first place? Victoria's expression shifted. I bring her to work events sometimes. Her therapist, one of her therapists, suggested that gradual exposure to social environments might help desensitize her over time. Supervised, controlled exposure. How's that been going? A pause. Not well. How does Lily feel about going? Victoria looked at him. She doesn't complain. Kids who don't complain are usually complying, he said, not consenting. The silence that followed was longer than the previous one. Victoria was looking at something just past his shoulder, not avoiding his eyes, but rearranging something internally, the way people did when a sentence landed in a place they'd been carefully not looking at. She never said she didn't want to go, Victoria said. Did you ask her? No. I told her what we were doing and she got dressed and came. Yeah. She stopped. Her jaw tightened slightly. That's not the same as checking whether she was okay with it. She's 6, he said. Not hard, not gentle, just even. She trusts that you know what's good for her. She's not going to push back on you. She's just going to find the service corridor. Victoria set her mug down with a precision that was controlled enough to be intentional. She was not angry at him. He could tell the difference. She was angry at herself, which was a different and more complicated thing to be in proximity to. I've spent a year trying to fix this, she said. The right specialists, the right approaches, the right environment at home. Her voice was careful. I restructured my entire work schedule. I hired an additional household assistant so there would always be someone available to her. I built a controlled environment. I know, he said. But? He turned his coffee cup a quarter rotation on the table. I wasn't going to say but. You were thinking it. He looked at her. She was looking back at him with the expression of someone who was used to having the full version of things and was tired of receiving the edited one. All those things you did, he said. They're all things you did. For her, yeah. But they're all you managing the situation. He paused. Did any of them involve just sitting next to her and shutting up for a while? The words were blunter than he'd intended. He wasn't cruel about it, but he wasn't soft about it either, and he watched it register on her face the way an honest thing registered when someone had been hearing polite things for a long time. No, she said after a moment. She's not a broken system, he said. She doesn't need to be fixed with the right approach. She needs to trust that the space next to her is safe. That's not a strategy. It's just being there without wanting anything. Victoria Ashford sat in a booth at Reardon's diner at 7:45 in the morning and was quiet for long enough that Phil came by once, clocked the table, and went back without refilling anything. That's harder than it sounds, she finally said. Yeah, for people who are used to solving things. Yeah. She looked at him. You do it. I had a reason to learn, he said. She didn't push on that. He appreciated it. They stayed another 20 minutes, and the conversation moved into easier territory. She asked about his work without the weight of Lily in it, the mechanics of what he actually did day to day, and he answered without false modesty or performance, because there was no reason to be either thing. She told him briefly about how Ashford Capital had started, not the polished investor summit version, but the actual version, which involved a studio apartment in Cincinnati and a position at a mid-size asset management firm where she had been the youngest analyst by a decade and had been treated accordingly and had responded by outworking everyone in the building for 4 straight years until she had enough capital and enough knowledge to do it herself. You were 24, he said. 23 when I started building the fund structure. 24 when we officially launched. She said it without pride, or at least without the performative kind, more like a fact she'd lived through. It was a terrible time to start a fund, objectively. You did it anyway. I didn't have another option I was willing to accept. He understood that. Not the finance version of it, but the architecture of the sentence. The way some people arrived at their lives, not through a series of positive choices, but through a systematic elimination of everything they refused to be. Same, he said. She looked at him and seemed to understand that he meant it, and didn't ask him to explain it further. And that was the moment. Not the one in the corridor the day before, but this one, this ordinary moment over cooling coffee in a vinyl booth, when he thought that she might actually be someone worth knowing. Us. He did not call her. That was not how he was built. But she called him on Saturday, and this time it was not about Lily. It was a question about the freight elevator at one of her building investments on the west side that she was in the process of renovating, and she had a contractor who was telling her one thing, and an engineer who was telling her something else, and she wanted a straight answer from someone who actually worked on these systems. He gave her a straight answer. It took about 4 minutes. She said, "Thank you, that's exactly what I needed." And then, "Lily asked about Emma again this morning." What did she ask? Whether Emma liked dogs. We don't have a dog. I think she's researching for the birthday party. Ethan was in his driveway, watching Emma chase a neighbor's cat with the specific intensity of a child who had not yet learned that cats were not interested in being caught. Emma tolerates dogs, he said. She prefers cats, but they won't come to her. Lily prefers dogs. She'll find that interesting. A pause. Would Emma want to come to the party? It's September 14th. It would be a small group. Lily doesn't do well with large groups. He watched Emma stop running, crouch down, and hold very still with her hand extended, trying to will the cat into range through sheer patient concentration. The cat regarded her from 6 feet away. "I'll ask her," he said. He asked her at dinner. Emma stopped eating and looked at him with the full focused attention she gave to things that mattered. "The girl from the elevator? Her name's Lily. I told you about her." "I remember." Emma picked up her fork again and turned this over. "Is she nice?" "She seemed like it." "Does she like cats?" "She likes dogs, I think." Emma frowned mildly. "That's okay. Does she know any good games?" "I don't know. You could ask her." Emma nodded slowly, the deliberate nod of a child making a genuine decision rather than just agreeing to please a parent. "Okay," she said. "I'll go." She went back to eating. Ethan watched her for a second. You sure?
Daddy. She gave him the look. I said okay. Okay, he said. He texted Victoria after Emma was asleep. Emma says she'll come. She wants to know if Lily knows any good games. The response came 11 minutes later. Lily has been compiling a list since this morning. I'm not sure whether to be relieved or slightly terrified. He read it twice. Then he put his phone face down on the table and finished his coffee. And outside the window, the Chicago summer night was warm and orange lit. And somewhere in this city, a 6-year-old girl who hadn't spoken to a stranger in 14 months was apparently making a list of games. And that was a thing that had happened because he'd sat down on a concrete floor and talked about cable tension. He didn't think of himself as someone who changed things. He'd spent years in the Navy operating under the working assumption that he was a mechanism, trained, deployed, extracted, redeployed, and that the events he participated in were the things that mattered, not him specifically. That framework had served him well in contexts that required him not to hesitate. It had served him less well in the years after, when he'd needed to understand what he was outside of the mechanism. Emma had helped him figure that out, not through anything deliberate, just through needing him to be present in ways that the mechanism had no protocol for. He looked at his phone once more. He did not text back. He washed his coffee mug, checked the locks on both doors, looked in on Emma the way he did every night without exception, and went to bed. The September date was 7 weeks away. He did not make plans. He did not build frameworks around it or decide in advance what it was or wasn't. He had learned, slowly and at some cost, that the things worth having usually announced themselves without requiring him to go looking, and that going looking tended to push them sideways. He slept. Outside, the city moved through its ordinary rhythms. The distant sound of a train, a dog somewhere a few streets over, the particular quiet of a residential neighborhood after 10. And none of it was remarkable, and all of it was his. The birthday party was held on a Saturday afternoon in the private garden behind Victoria's townhouse in Lincoln Park, which was a neighborhood that Ethan had driven through many times without ever having a reason to stop. The townhouse was the kind of building that didn't announce itself. No gates, no visible security, just a brownstone facade on a quiet tree-lined street that happened to be worth considerably more per square foot than anything within 6 blocks of where Ethan lived. He noticed this without judgment. He'd been in enough places in his life that the geography of money had stopped impressing him somewhere around his 3rd deployment, when he'd extracted a family from a compound that would have been featured in an architecture magazine if the context had been different. He parked on the street and sat in the truck for a moment. Emma was in the passenger seat wearing a yellow dress she had selected herself and a pair of sneakers she had also selected herself, which did not match the dress, but which she had defended with the argument that they were her fastest shoes and she might need to run. And Ethan had decided that this was not a battle worth having. "You ready?" he said. Emma had been looking out the window at the townhouse. "It's big." "It is." "Do rich people have regular birthday parties?" "I don't know," he said honestly. "We're about to find out." Emma considered this and then opened the door. The party turned out to be 8 children, which was small enough that it didn't overwhelm the garden, but large enough that the noise was substantial. There were no pony rides or magicians or elaborate entertainment structures, just lawn games that had been set up with evident care, a table with food that was good without being precious, and a very large dog named Biscuit, who was theoretically contained in the far corner of the garden by a low fence that he appeared to be treating as a suggestion. Lily was standing near the garden door when they came through, and she saw Emma before Emma saw her, and Ethan watched the calculation happen on Lily's face, the brief internal negotiation of a child who wanted something and was deciding whether wanting it was safe. Then Emma turned and their eyes met, and Lily said, clearly and without preamble, "Do you know how to play capture the flag?" Emma's face lit up. "Yes." "Good. Nobody else here knows the real rules." They were gone within 30 seconds. Ethan stood at the edge of the garden and watched them go, Emma's yellow dress disappearing around a hedge with Lily's red one right beside it, and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't immediately have a name for. "She's been standing there for 40 minutes waiting." Victoria appeared beside him. She was in dark jeans and a simple white shirt, and she looked different from both previous encounters. Less assembled, less in command of the situation, and somehow more like a real person because of it.
She was watching Lily with the expression of someone observing something they'd been afraid to hope for. Emma takes a while to warm up usually, Ethan said. They seem fine. Yeah. They stood watching the garden for a moment. Thank you for coming, Victoria said. Emma wanted to. I know, but you didn't have to bring her. She glanced at him sideways. You could have sent her with someone else. He didn't answer that because there was no version of his life in which he sent his 6-year-old daughter to a stranger's house without being present himself, and he suspected Victoria understood that and was saying something else with the observation. Biscuit had cleared the low fence and was now galloping toward Emma with the determination of a dog who had been waiting all day for someone to properly appreciate him. Emma shrieked, not in fear, in delight, and grabbed Lily's arm, and they both ran in the opposite direction with Biscuit in joyful pursuit, and Lily was laughing, openly, with her whole face, and Victoria made a sound beside him that was almost nothing, just a small, sharp exhale, and he understood that she was watching her daughter laugh and trying to keep it together. He looked away to give her the moment. The other parents were polite to him in the careful way that people were polite to someone they couldn't immediately categorize. A few of them were connected to Victoria's professional world. He picked that up from the way they spoke about things, the references they made. One man named Harrison, who had the build of someone who had once been athletic and was now mostly meetings, tried twice to engage Ethan in conversation about the investment climate, and Ethan responded in ways that were genuine and unhelpful, and Harrison eventually drifted away. One of the mothers, a small direct woman named Carla, whose daughter was apparently Lily's closest school friend, sat down next to Ethan on the garden bench and said without any preliminary, "You're the elevator guy." "That's me." "Lily talked about you," Carla said, "at drop-off on Monday, to my daughter. First time she'd talked to another kid at drop-off in—" She shook her head. "A long time. My daughter came home and told me about the cable tension gauge." Ethan looked at her. "I know," Carla said, like he'd said something. "I know, it was just, she was talking, like a regular kid, explaining things." She looked out at the garden where their daughters were now deep in what appeared to be a complex negotiation with Biscuit. "Lily's had a hard year. Victoria doesn't talk about it much, but it's been hard on both of them." "I can see that," he said. "You're not what I expected," Carla said. "What did you expect?" She made a small gesture. "I don't know. Victoria's world tends to produce a specific type. You're not that type." "No," he agreed. "Is that intentional?" He thought about it. "I don't think I'd know how to be the other type even if I tried." Carla smiled at that. "The genuine kind, not the social kind. That's probably why it worked." Take happened at 3:30. Lily blew out the candles on a chocolate cake without any fuss and immediately cut the first piece and handed it to Emma, which made Emma beam like she'd been given something significant because she understood the social weight of first piece of cake even at 6, maybe especially at 6. Ethan was helping move plates back to the table when Victoria came to stand beside him again. "She's doing well," he said, meaning Lily. "She is." Victoria picked up a stack of plates and carried them without any indication that this was beneath her or above her, just did the task because the task needed doing. "Can I ask you something I might be overstepping with?" "You can ask." "You said you learned to sit with Emma without needing anything from her, after your wife died." She said it carefully, not delicately. There was a difference. "How long did that take to figure out?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. Around them, the garden was winding down, kids getting sugar crashed and quieter, parents beginning the choreography of gathering things. "I didn't figure it out," he said. "I ran out of other options first. I tried the structured approach, the routines and the strategies and the developmental milestone tracking." He set down the plates he was holding. "Emma was 2 when Maya died. She wasn't old enough to explain what she needed. She just needed me to be there, in the room, not performing and not managing, just there." He paused. "I had to get very uncomfortable with doing nothing before I could understand that doing nothing was the thing." Victoria was listening with her full attention, the kind that was genuinely receiving rather than waiting for a gap to respond into. "I keep trying to build the right container," she said. "The right environment, the right conditions. Yeah. And you're telling me the container isn't the point." "I'm not telling you anything," he said. "I'm just describing what happened to me." She looked at him. You do that a lot. What? Step back from giving advice while giving it. It's not advice if it's just what happened to me. It functions as advice, she said. It's just more honest about its limitations. She looked out at the garden. Most people who give me advice don't acknowledge that their experience might not translate. They just assume it does. Most people's experience doesn't translate to most other people, he said. That's not a reason not to share it. It's just a reason to be clear about what it is. She was quiet. Your husband, he said, then stopped. I'm sorry. You mentioned Lily's father. You don't have to… No, it's fine. She set her plates down too. Daniel. We weren't married. We were together for 2 years, and Lily was not planned. And when she was born, he stayed for another 18 months because I think he believed the experience would change how he felt. And it didn't, and he left. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who has processed something enough times that the sharp edges are worn down, but the shape of it is still there. He sees her occasionally, holidays, sometimes a birthday. He's not cruel about it. He's just absent in the ways that matter. How does Lily handle that? She doesn't talk about him. Victoria paused, which, given this past year, has covered a lot of ground. Ethan nodded slowly. She talked to you the day she met you, Victoria said. She doesn't talk to Daniel when he visits. He didn't respond to that immediately because he could see what she was circling and he wasn't sure he was the right person to help her land there. I can't tell you what that means, he said finally. She met me in a place where there was no expectation. Your ex has expectation written all over him every time he shows up, whatever he thinks he's communicating. Kids feel that. I know. Victoria rubbed the back of her neck, an unguarded gesture, the kind that didn't make it into board meetings. I feel it too when he comes. This pressure. Like everything about the visit has to somehow compensate for the fact that he's not consistently there. Does it work? No. Yeah. They stood in the remains of a birthday party in a Lincoln Park garden, two people who had arrived at this conversation from very different directions, and the afternoon light was doing the long amber thing it did in late September in Chicago, and neither of them tried to make the moment into something it wasn't. I should get back to the kids, he said. Of course. He pushed off from the table. Then he stopped. For what it's worth, he said, not turning around fully, just half. You sat on a garden bench for 3 hours watching her run around with my kid. You didn't check your phone. You didn't take a single call. He looked at her. That's the thing you've been trying to do. You're already doing it. He went back toward the lawn. Behind him, he heard her breathe out, long and slow, and he did not look back. Emma talked about Lily for the entire drive home, covering the complete rules of the capture the flag variant they'd invented, the detailed personality profile of Biscuit, and her assessment that Lily was a planner, but the good kind, which was high praise from Emma, who distrusted planning that didn't account for dogs. Ethan listened and made the right noises and drove home through the Sunday amber light and felt the specific weight of a day that had been more than he'd expected going in. He didn't analyze it. He'd learned a long time ago that analyzing things while they were still happening was how you stopped being present for them. He just drove and listened to his daughter's voice and made a mental note to replace the wiper blades before winter set. October came in cold. Chicago cold had a character to it that Ethan respected, not the brutal theatrical cold of deep winter, but the advance notice cold of October, the city telling you to start paying attention. He liked October. It was honest about what was coming and didn't apologize for it. He and Victoria had fallen into a loose pattern of communication that had developed without either of them explicitly agreeing to it. A text, sometimes. Occasionally a question from her about something mechanical or logistical that she could have asked anyone but chose to ask him, and he understood that the mechanical question was often not really the point. He called her once on a Tuesday evening because Emma had said something at dinner about Lily that made him think she might want to know, and they'd talked for 40 minutes about things that had nothing to do with the reason he'd called, and neither of them pointed that out. She came to the shop once in late October. He hadn't invited her. She'd been nearby for a site visit to a property she was considering acquiring on the west side and had texted that she was 10 minutes away and asked if it was a bad time. He'd said it was fine. Danny had looked up when she walked in and then looked at Ethan with an expression that Ethan declined to acknowledge. She looked around the shop with genuine attention, at the equipment, at the organized wall of parts, at the job board on the east wall, where Danny tracked their open tickets. "This is what I pictured," she said. "What did you picture?" "Ordered, specific systems for specific things." She looked at the job board. "You have a lot of open tickets." "It's been a good October." "How many jobs is that?" 14 active. We're 2 guys. She looked at him. "You need more people." "Probably." "Why don't you hire?" He picked up a brake component he'd been cleaning and went back to work. "Because hiring means managing, and managing people is a different job than fixing elevators. I'm better at the second one." "You managed people in the Navy." He glanced up at her. "Who told you that?" "You implied it," she said, "when you talked about calming civilians in rescue operations. You don't do that as a one-man operation." He turned the component over in his hand. "I led a team. That's different from managing employees." "How?" "In the Navy, the mission is the thing everyone organizes around. There's no ambiguity about what matters. In a business," he set the component down. "People have bad days. People have rent problems. People need the job to be something it isn't always going to be." "That's true of any team," she said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "How many employees do you have?" "At Ashford Capital directly, 41. Through portfolio companies, around 400. "And you know how to manage 400 people?" "No," she said. "I know how to build systems that manage them, which is different." She paused. "But you're right, that it's not the same as leading a team through something where everyone agrees on the objective." "Hardest part of leaving," he said. Not like he was sharing something significant, just like it was true. "In the military, the objective is always clear. Some of the objectives were terrible, and I disagreed with them, and I followed them anyway, but they were clear. Out here," he gestured vaguely at the shop, at the street outside the window. "Everyone's making up the objective as they go." "What's yours?" she asked. "Your objective," he answered without hesitating, because this was one of the things he had actually figured out. Emma gets to adulthood in one piece, with enough of a foundation that she can make her own choices. Everything else is infrastructure. Victoria was quiet. "That's very clear," she said. "Yeah." "Mine used to be that clear," she said. "Build the fund, reach the number, then the number kept changing." She looked at the job board. "I hit 100 million in assets under management, and I thought that was the number. Then it was 250, then it was 1 billion. She said the billion without any satisfaction in it, just as data. "I reached 1 billion last year, and Lily stopped speaking to strangers, and I spent 3 months not understanding why the timing felt like something." Ethan was looking at her. "It wasn't the timing," she said. It was me. I'd been so locked into the objective that I'd stopped being in the house even when I was in the house." She met his eyes. "Lily stopped speaking to strangers the same month I closed the biggest deal of my life. I was home for 48 hours that entire month." He didn't say anything. There was nothing to say that she hadn't already said to herself. "I know what caused it," she said. "I've known for a while. Knowing what caused it doesn't mean I know how to fix it." "You're fixing it," he said. "I'm trying to fix it." "That's what fixing looks like," he said. "From the inside, it feels like trying. From the outside, it looks like motion." She looked at him with an expression he hadn't seen from her before. Not the controlled boardroom composure, not the raw, undone look from the corridor, but something in between, something that was just her, without a layer on it. "How do you do that?" she said. "Do what?" "Say the thing that actually helps without making it sound like a lesson." He shrugged. "I'm not trying to teach you anything. I'm just—" He picked up the component again. "Talking." Danny appeared from the back of the shop with a coffee mug and stopped when he saw Victoria. He looked at Ethan. Ethan looked at him. Danny turned around and went back. Victoria almost smiled. "Your partner." "Danny Reyes, 11 years. He's better with hydraulic systems than anyone I've ever worked with." "You trust him?" "Completely." "That's rarer than it sounds," she said. "Most things are." She stayed another 20 minutes. She didn't pretend it was still about the property on the west side, and he didn't ask her to. When she left, Danny appeared immediately from the back with both hands wrapped around his mug and said nothing for a long moment. "Don't," Ethan said. "I haven't said anything." "Keep it that way." Danny nodded slowly, with the expression of a man preserving enormous amounts of commentary through sheer professional restraint, and went back to his hydraulic system. November arrived with the first real cold front. the kind that made the city hunker down and stop pretending. Emma had been asking about Lily with the frequency of someone who had decided on a friend and was now in the administrative phase of the friendship, wanting to know when the next visit was and whether Lily had read the same books and whether Biscuit was going to be there. Ethan texted Victoria on a Thursday evening. Emma wants to know if Lily wants to come to the Museum of Science and Industry on Saturday. No pressure. 3 minutes. Lily has already said yes. I showed her your message before asking if you'd mind. He read that twice. Then, works for us. 10 a.m.? We'll be there. He put his phone down. Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table with the particular focused scowl she inherited from him, pencil moving across the page with more force than was strictly necessary. He watched her for a moment. Museum Saturday, he said. Lily's coming. Emma looked up. Is Biscuit coming? Museums don't usually allow dogs. Emma considered the injustice of this. Okay, she said finally, and went back to her homework. The Museum of Science and Industry was the kind of place that rewarded whoever was willing to read the placards, which turned out to be both girls. They moved through the exhibits with a bilateral intensity that left Ethan and Victoria trailing behind them by about 6 feet, and the two of them fell into conversation in the natural low-register way of two adults tracking children through a crowd, half attentive to the girls, half attentive to each other, which was its own kind of intimacy without either of them naming it as such. They were standing in front of a large cross-section display of a building's elevator shaft, full scale, behind glass, when Lily called back to Ethan without turning around. Ethan, is this right? It says the counterweight is 45% of the car weight plus half the rated load. He looked at the placard from where he stood. That's the standard. Depending on the application, it varies. Lily turned around to look at him with an expression that was pure engineer. Why does it vary? Speed, load capacity, shaft geometry. A freight elevator in a warehouse and a passenger elevator in a hotel have different requirements even if they look the same from the outside. Lily processed this with a serious nod and turned back to the display. Emma was already 3 placards ahead, reading about drive systems with her nose about 4 inches from the text. Victoria was looking at Ethan. What? He said. Nothing. She talks to you like you're a reference book. That's fine. It's more than fine, Victoria said. She doesn't talk to most adults like they're worth consulting. She paused. She talks to her therapist like she's waiting for the session to end. Current therapist? 3rd one this year. The approach is good, theoretically. Lily just doesn't connect with her. Victoria watched her daughter move to the next display. I think she finds the therapeutic framing obvious, like she can see the structure underneath it, and it makes the whole thing feel artificial. Smart kids are rough on therapy that way, he said. How would you know? It came out genuinely curious, not pointed, and he answered it honestly. Emma went through a period at 4.5 where she wasn't sleeping, after Maya died. A pediatric grief counselor. Good person, wrong approach, too much directed play, too much guided discussion. Emma kept trying to redirect the sessions into conversations about whatever she was actually thinking about. He watched Emma disappear around a corner. We found someone better. She sees her still once a month. Emma calls her the homework lady because she always gives Emma something to try before the next session. She doesn't mind going? She decides whether to go. We discuss it. She decides. Victoria looked at him. She's 6. She's 6 and she has opinions about what helps her, he said. I'd rather build the habit of her knowing her own mind early than have her go somewhere because I've decided it's good for her. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I decide what's good for Lily, she said, and then stopped. It sounded honest. It sounded like what I've been doing. He didn't argue with that. You can decide what's good for her, he said, and also check whether it's working. Those aren't the same thing. Victoria looked at the elevator shaft display for a moment. Around them, the museum moved in its Saturday crowd patterns, families and school groups and couples, the general beautiful noise of people paying attention to something that interested them. I've been operating on the assumption that if I do the right things, the right outcomes will follow, she said. If I hire the right therapist, if I create the right environment, if I show up consistently. She turned to look at him. But outcomes aren't guaranteed by inputs, I know that. In investment, I know it intuitively. You can do everything right and the market still moves against you. She shook her head slightly. I can't apply that same logic to Lily because it terrifies me. Because you can walk away from a bad investment, he said. Yes. You can't walk away from this. No. He looked at her. She was looking at the display, jaw set, and he could see the full weight of the past year on her face. Not dramatically, not in tears, just in the specific tired lines of someone who had been frightened for a long time without allowing themselves to show it. You're not going to lose her, he said. You can't know that. I know that she made a list of games for a birthday party she'd never had a friend at before, he said. And she learned the cable tension gauge in 20 minutes, and she talks to a museum display the same way my daughter reads placards. He paused. Whatever you've been doing wrong, you've also been doing enough right that she's still curious, still learning, still extending herself. He paused again. Lily being quiet for 14 months wasn't her giving up. It was her waiting. Victoria turned her head away from him. He could see her throat move. They stood in front of the elevator display for another moment without speaking. Then Emma appeared from around the corner at a run, Lily right behind her, and Emma grabbed Ethan's arm. Daddy, there's a whole section about hydraulics, and Lily says she wants to see the coal mine exhibit first. But I think we should do hydraulics because it connects to what you do, and then coal mine after. Coal mine first, Lily said with calm certainty. Emma turned to Ethan. Daddy. Coal mine, he said. Emma looked betrayed. Then she looked at Lily. Then she said, with the tone of someone making a major concession, Fine, but hydraulics is 20 minutes at least. 30, Lily said. 25. Deal. They shook on it with complete seriousness and ran back around the corner. Ethan and Victoria followed them, and somewhere between the coal mine exhibit and the hydraulics section and the cafeteria lunch that ran long, because Lily wanted to explain to Emma exactly how a counterweight compensated for cab load, Victoria laughed 4 times. Real laughs, not managed ones. And Ethan noticed every single one of them without saying anything about it. On the drive home, Emma fell asleep in the back seat before they'd cleared the parking lot, and Ethan drove through the gray November city with the heater running and his daughter's breath fogging slightly against the cold window glass. And he thought about how long it had been since a Saturday had felt like this much. Not like a good day exactly, but like a real one, with weight and texture and the particular quality of time that meant something had actually happened in it. He didn't call it anything. He just drove home. December came in the way Chicago Decembers did, not gradually, but as a verdict. One morning, the temperature dropped 16 degrees between 6 a.m. and noon, and by the following Thursday, there was ice on the inside of Ethan's truck windows when he started it at 5:45, which was a problem he fixed with a scraper and a 10-minute idle, and which he'd been fixing every winter for 4 years without ever quite remembering to buy the better door seals he kept meaning to order. The work slowed slightly in December, the way it always did. Fewer new contracts, more emergency calls when building systems that had been limping through fall finally gave out in the cold. He and Danny picked up 2 emergency jobs in the first 2 weeks, both hospitals, both freight elevator systems that had been deferred on maintenance budgets for longer than anyone wanted to officially acknowledge. Ethan didn't complain about emergency work. It paid better, it was straightforward, and it left no room for the kind of ambient thinking that could make a quiet evening feel longer than it was. He was finishing the write-up on the second hospital job at his kitchen table on a Wednesday night when his phone rang. Not Victoria, a number he recognized after a second as belonging to a man named Walt Grierson, who was a retired Navy commander and had been Ethan's commanding officer for the last 3 years of his active service. Walt called maybe twice a year, always in the evening, and the calls were always the same comfortable length, 40 minutes, 45, and covered the same ground in different configurations, people they'd served with, what those people were doing now, the occasional carefully framed observation about the world that was Walt's way of checking whether Ethan was still connected to it. "How's Chicago?" Walt said when Ethan picked up. "Cold." "Good cold or bad cold?" "Just cold." Ethan pushed the job right up aside. "What's going on?" "Nothing particular. Checking in." A pause that had something in it. "Ran into Marcus Webb last week at a thing in Virginia." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Marcus Webb had been on his team for 2.5 years, had been present for both classified extraction operations, and had left the Navy 8 months after Ethan with a knee that would never fully work the way it had before Kandahar, and a general disposition toward not discussing any of it. "How is he?" Ethan said. "Good. Better than he was."
He's got a job with a security consulting firm in McLean. Doing all right. Walt paused. He asked about you. What did you tell him?
That you were fixing elevators in Chicago and apparently doing it well enough to turn down 3 separate contracts I know of in the past year. Ethan looked at his kitchen window. Outside, the streetlight caught the ice on the front walk. Where'd you hear about the contracts? People talk, Ethan. When someone with your background and your record says no to serious money, people notice. Walt's voice was neutral, the particular neutrality of a man choosing not to push. I'm not calling to pitch you anything, just noting that you've been noticed. I'm where I want to be, Ethan said. I know that. I'm not arguing with it. Another pause. Marcus said something else. He said that whatever you were doing up there, you seemed settled in a way you hadn't been when you left. His word was settled. I thought that was interesting. When did you talk to Marcus about me? I didn't. He talked to Danny Reyes, apparently. Small world. Ethan made a mental note to discuss this with Danny, who was going to respond to that mental note with absolutely zero remorse. I'm fine, Walt, he said. I know you are. That's what I wanted to confirm. Walt shifted into the easier part of the call then, news about mutual acquaintances, a brief story about something that had gone wrong at a veterans event he'd helped organize, a question about Emma that he always asked because he'd met Emma once, at Maya's funeral, and had been genuinely charmed by her even at age 2. Ethan answered and asked his own questions, and they talked for 43 minutes, and when the call ended, he sat for a while in the quiet kitchen with his phone face up on the table. Settled. He turned the word over a few times, testing it the way you tested a repair, not for whether it sounded right, but for whether it held under actual pressure. He decided Marcus Webb was a more accurate observer than most people gave him credit for, and went to bed. He told Victoria about the call the following Saturday. They had arrived at a pattern of Saturdays that neither had explicitly planned. The girls together, usually at his house now, because Emma had decided that Lily needed to understand what a real neighborhood felt like, which was Emma's term for the streets around their house, as opposed to Lincoln Park, which she had determined was too quiet in a different way than quiet was supposed to be. Lily had visited 4 times now, and each time she'd integrated herself into the neighborhood's small ecology with the systematic curiosity of a scientist conducting fieldwork. She knew the names of 2 other kids on the block, had developed opinions about the specific corner store 3 streets over versus the one on Ethan's block, and had formed a working relationship with the neighbor's cat that Emma had never managed, which Emma found impressive and slightly unfair. Victoria had started coming with Lily instead of just dropping her off, and this had happened incrementally enough that Ethan wasn't sure exactly when it had shifted from drop-off to staying, except that at some point he'd started making enough coffee for 2 adults, and that seemed to have answered the question. She was at his kitchen table with both hands around a mug when he told her about Walt's call, and she listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd noticed about her. She had learned, or was learning, to let a thing finish before she responded to it. Settled, she said when he finished. That was the word. Are you? He thought about it honestly instead of answering from the first thing that came up. More than I was. Yeah. What does less settled feel like? For you specifically. He got up and refilled his mug even though it didn't need refilling, because it gave him something to do with his hands while he arranged the answer. The first year after Maya, he said, I operated on about 4 hours of sleep and spent the rest of the time making sure everything in our lives had a system. Meals, schedule, Emma's routine. Danny had to basically force me to take jobs that required any flexibility because I'd built everything so tight that deviation felt like a threat. He sat back down. I knew I was doing it. I'd managed enough high-stress environments to recognize the pattern. Couldn't stop it anyway. Control is a grief response, Victoria said. Yeah. He looked at her. You know that one. She didn't look away from it. I do. I built a billion-dollar company instead of being in the house. Same mechanism, bigger scale. Yours was already there before Lily, he said. It was just, it escalated, she said. Yes. She set her mug down. Daniel leaving was the first time I'd failed at something significant since the Cincinnati apartment. I didn't know how to process it, so I worked. And then working became the only thing that felt stable, and stability became the thing I optimized for. And somewhere in there, Lily became part of the optimization problem instead of the reason I was trying to be stable in the first place.
It was the most direct she'd been about any of it since the coffee at Reardon's, and he heard it for what it was. Not a confession, not a request for something, just an honest accounting from someone who had done enough looking at the thing to describe it accurately. "How is she now?" he said, "compared to October." Victoria considered it. Outside, they could hear the girls, some kind of structured game in the backyard that involved periodic loud rulings from Lily and Emma's cheerful appeals of those rulings. "Different," Victoria said. "She talks in the mornings now. Before it used to be silent until she'd been up for an hour. I think the transition from sleep was hard, too much unstructured space. Now she's talking before breakfast, asking questions." She paused. "She asked me last week what I was working on. Not in a polite way. In a genuine way, like she actually wanted to know." "What did you tell her?" "I told her about the infrastructure initiative." Victoria picked her mug back up. "I'd been keeping my work fairly surface level at home. I didn't want to bring the stress of it into the house. But she asked a real question, and I gave her a real answer, and she spent 20 minutes asking follow-up questions about why infrastructure businesses were undervalued by institutional investors." A small pause. "She's 6. Emma asks me about break housing," he said. "It's different when you're not expecting it." She looked at him. "When you're used to the space between you and your child being something you're managing rather than something that's just open." He nodded. "I've been doing the infrastructure initiative for 2 months," she said. "It started because of something you said in October, about how every problem doesn't require a strategy. Some things just need someone who makes the space feel safe. I couldn't stop thinking about it in a business context. What it looks like when capital is structured around safety and reliability instead of maximum extraction." She looked at her coffee. "Small infrastructure firms, elevator maintenance companies, hydraulic specialists, electrical contractors, they do essential work and they operate on margins that make them permanently vulnerable. A bad quarter, one equipment failure, one contract that falls through, and they're done." Ethan was looking at her. "I started building a fund structure in November," she said. "Patient capital, long investment horizons, focus on firms with strong technical expertise and leadership that actually knows the work, not just the business side." She met his eyes. "It's not a charity. It'll return. But the return timeline is 15 years instead of 3, which makes it uninteresting to most of the people I work with." "How much are you putting in?" "Initial commitment is $200 million. I have 4 limited partners so far. I want 10. He was quiet for a moment. "Victoria." "It's a real investment thesis," she said, and there was a slight edge in her voice that wasn't defensive but was making sure he understood. "I didn't build this because you fixed our elevator. I built it because you said something true about how value works, and I applied it to a market I understand. Those are different things." "I know," he said. "I was going to say it sounds right." The edge softened. "Oh. Infrastructure's been systematically underinvested for 30 years because the return horizon doesn't fit the quarterly reporting cycle," he said. "You're not discovering something new. You're just willing to operate on a different clock than most people." "Yes." She looked at him. "Your company is not one of the firms I'm targeting, in case that's a concern." "I know." I wanted to say it explicitly. "I know," he said again. Danny would have said yes and I would have said no, and we'd have had a very long conversation about it. She almost smiled. "You would have said no." "I built this specific thing," he said. "My terms, my timeline, my decisions. I'm not going to hand that to someone else's investment structure, doesn't matter whose." "That's exactly the profile I'm not targeting," she said. "You're not a scalable investment. You're a one-man and Danny operation that works because of who the one-man is." Danny would be very hurt by that characterization. Danny is exceptional with hydraulic systems, and you know what I meant. Ethan's mouth pulled sideways in the thing that wasn't quite a smile, but that she had learned to read as the functional equivalent. January. The kind of Chicago January that reminded you the city had been built by people who either hadn't fully thought through the climate implications or had thought them through and decided they were acceptable, which amounted to the same thing. Ethan's truck required 10 minutes of idle every morning before the heater produced anything useful, and he stood in his driveway in the dark. Those mornings with his hands in his jacket pockets and watched the exhaust cloud in the streetlight and thought about nothing specific, which was the closest he got to meditation and which served roughly the same purpose. He had started to understand somewhere in November, but becoming clearer through December and into January, that something between him and Victoria had moved into a territory neither of them had named. This was not an observation that came with urgency attached to it. It was just something he noticed, the way he noticed when a cable tension reading was shifting from acceptable to needs attention. Not an emergency, but worth tracking. She had called him on a Tuesday night in early January, which was unusual because they texted more than they called, and her voice had the particular quality of someone who had been holding something at arm's length for a while and had gotten tired. "Can I ask you something personal?" she said. "Yeah." "Do you get lonely?" He was at the kitchen table again, where he seemed to be whenever anything significant happened by phone. He looked at the window. "Sometimes," he said. "What does that look like for you?" He thought about how to answer that honestly. "It looks like a Saturday night after Emma's asleep when the house is quiet, and I'm aware of the quiet in a way I'm not during the week. It looks like Danny making a joke that Maya would have found funny and me laughing and then not." He paused. "It doesn't look like anything dramatic. It's just weight that sits there." Victoria was quiet on the other end. "I ask," she said, "because I've been lonely for a long time, and I've been good at not calling it that. I called it busy. I called it focused." A pause. "Lily asked me last week if I had any friends. Not clients or colleagues. Friends. And I started to answer, and I couldn't." He didn't say anything immediately. "What did you tell her?" he said. "I told her I was working on it." "That's honest." She said, "Is Ethan your friend?" Victoria's voice was careful. "I didn't know how to answer that either." Ethan looked at his hands on the table. "What did you say?" he asked. "I said yes." A pause. Is that an accurate thing to have told her?" "Yeah," he said. "It's accurate." She breathed out. "Okay." "Victoria." "Yes." "I'm not good at this," he said. "I want to be clear about that up front. I'm better at knowing what a situation is than at knowing what to do about it." "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to do anything about it. I just wanted to know what to tell my daughter." "Tell her yes," he said. "That part's accurate." A long pause. "All right," she said. "Good night, Ethan." "Good night." He sat at the table for a while after. He was not a man who processed things quickly. He'd accepted this about himself years ago. He was thorough, which was different from slow, but it looked the same from the outside. He took the conversation apart, the way he took a break housing apart, component by component, in order. And when he had examined it fully, he put it back together and sat with it. And what it amounted to was something simple, that a person he respected had told him she was lonely and had asked whether what they had could be called friendship, and he'd said yes, and that was the true thing to have said. He checked on Emma. He locked the doors. He went to bed. The phone call that complicated everything came on a Thursday in late January, and it did not come to Ethan. It came to Victoria from a man named Richard Colum, who was a senior partner at a private equity firm called Stratton Weil that had been one of Ashford Capital's earliest institutional backers. Richard Colum was 61, had the specific kind of authority that came from 20 years of being the most important person in most rooms he entered, and did not typically call directly. He had people for that. When his name came up on Victoria's phone at 2 in the afternoon, she picked up without the usual consideration, because Richard calling directly meant something. "I'll get to it, Richard said, after about 90 seconds of preliminary. "There are some of our partners who are concerned about the direction of the infrastructure fund." Victoria was at her desk. She set her pen down. "What kind of concern?" "The return timeline. 15 years is outside the model we've built our LP relationships around. Our investors have expectations." "I presented the timeline to everyone who committed capital," Victoria said. "No one raised objections at the table." "People don't raise objections at the table when Victoria Ashford is presenting," Richard said, not unkindly. "They raise them after, to each other, and eventually one of them calls me." She was quiet for a moment. "Who specifically?" "That's not something I'm going to tell you. What I'm telling you is that there's pressure internally to revisit the structure, shorten the horizon, adjust the return targets." "If I shorten the horizon, the thesis doesn't hold," she said. "You can't do patient capital infrastructure investment on a 5-year exit timeline. That's just a different product with a different name. I know that. I'm not telling you what to do. I'm telling you what's in the air."
A pause. There's also been some conversation, and again, I'm relaying, not endorsing, about some of the specific firms you've been consulting. The elevator maintenance company. Victoria was very still. Cross Mechanical, Richard said. It's come up in conversation as an example of the kind of firm the fund is supposedly focused on. Some partners feel the principal has a personal connection to that company that wasn't disclosed. Cross Mechanical is not in the fund, Victoria said, and her voice was controlled in the way that required active work. I have consulted them twice on properties in my existing portfolio, which is standard practice for any operational real estate holding. There is nothing to disclose. I know that. I've looked at it. Richard paused. But the perception is there. And in this business, perception isn't fact. No. But it shapes how fact gets received. His voice was even, experienced. Victoria, I'm on your side. I've been on your side for 8 years. I'm calling because I think you should know before it becomes something official. She thanked him and ended the call and sat at her desk for a long time looking at nothing. She was not panicking. She did not panic. She had trained herself out of it the same way she'd trained herself out of most things that felt uncontrollable. She was thinking, specifically and precisely, about what the conversation meant and what she needed to do about it. The infrastructure fund was sound. She knew it was sound. She could defend every element of the thesis with data, and she intended to. But Richard was right that perception moved differently than fact, and the cross-mechanical thread, thin as it was, baseless as it was a thread that could be pulled, and in her experience, threads that could be pulled eventually got pulled by someone. She called Ethan that evening, not to tell him everything. She wasn't ready for that yet, and there were things she needed to sort through before she put them into words. But because she'd learned that talking to him helped her think, and she needed to think. Something came up at work, she said. Okay. Nothing critical, navigable. She paused. I might need to recuse myself from some decisions around the fund's marketing strategy in the short term. Perception issue. I don't want to go into the details tonight. He didn't ask. She'd noticed he never pushed on the professional details unless she offered them, which was one of the ways he was different from most people in her world, who treated information as currency and were always working out the exchange rate. Are you all right? He said. I'm annoyed, she said, which is a better state than most of the alternatives. Annoyance is useful, he said. Keeps you sharp. I'll remind you of that the next time I'm irritated about something small. Go ahead, I'll handle it. She almost laughed. Almost. How's Emma? Asleep. She had a day. Lily? Similar. They must coordinate. A brief pause. She told me tonight that Emma is her best friend. He was quiet. She's never said that about anyone, Victoria said. Best friend. She said it the same way you'd say any other fact. Emma is my best friend, like it was just information. What did you say? I said that Emma was lucky to have her. She paused again. And then Lily said, We're both lucky, and went to brush her teeth. He didn't say anything for a moment. Yeah, he said quietly. Yeah, she said. The confrontation with Richard Colm's partners came 6 days later, in a conference room on the 43rd floor of a building on LaSalle Street where Stratton Weil kept their Chicago offices. There were 4 of them, 2 partners, 1 general counsel, and a man named Davis Holt, no relation to Gerald, who held the title of head of risk and had the energy of someone who had spent his career identifying reasons not to do things. Victoria walked into that room with the full file, fund documents, the 2 cross-mechanical consulting invoices, a standard portfolio service vendor, correspondence records, a 3-page summary of the infrastructure thesis, and its return projections benchmarked against comparable patient capital vehicles from the past 20 years. She had prepared for 2 hours the night before, at her kitchen table while Lily slept, with the same focused precision she'd brought to every important presentation since Cincinnati. She put the file on the table. Let's talk about it, she said. What followed was 70 minutes of the most precise professional conversation of her career. Not because she raised her voice or applied pressure, she did neither, but because she had prepared for every objection before it arrived and answered each one without conceding the ground beneath it. The cross-mechanical issue she addressed in 4 sentences. The consulting engagements were disclosed on the portfolio vendor register. The firm was not and had never been a fund investment candidate. The principal's personal acquaintance with the vendor was not a conflict under the fund's governance documents,
and she would welcome a formal review by outside counsel if the partners felt that was warranted. Davis Holt said that might be prudent.
Victoria said she'd have her legal team provide all documentation by end of week. She left the meeting with the fund intact and the timeline intact and the formal review scheduled, which was an inconvenience she could absorb and which would find nothing because there was nothing to find. She sat in the car for 10 minutes afterward. Then she called Ethan. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about why I was vague last week." She told him about the Stratton-Weil conversation, the cross-mechanical question, what she'd said in the conference room. She told him clearly and without dramatizing it, the way she had learned to present difficult things. The facts first, then the context, then the implications. He listened all the way through. "Are you in a bad position?" he said when she finished. "No, the review will clear it. There's nothing there." "Then why are you telling me?" She had thought about this question because she'd known he would ask it. "Because it involved you," she said. "Indirectly, but it did. And I don't want to be the kind of person who manages what you know about situations that involve you." A pause. "My name came up in a room I wasn't in," he said. "Yes." "In a way that was meant to raise doubt about you." "Yes." "And you handled it." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for telling me." "I wasn't going to not tell you." "I know," he said. "That's why I'm thanking you." She sat in the car outside the Stratton-Weil building with the heat running and watched people move along the LaSalle Street sidewalk in the gray January cold, and thought that she had been in this city for 9 years and had never found it particularly beautiful, and that it looked different right now for reasons she wasn't going to analyze in a parking structure on a Thursday afternoon. "Victoria," Ethan said. "Still here." "Go home," he said. "You did the hard part." "I know." "Emma wants to know if Lily can sleep over Friday." She laughed. Real, sudden, exactly what she needed. "I'll ask her." She drove home. The sleepover happened on Friday and lasted until Sunday afternoon because neither girl was willing to acknowledge that it had technically ended. And Ethan made pancakes Saturday morning, with both of them standing on chairs at the counter, trying to be helpful in ways that doubled the mess, but that he didn't stop because the mess was worth what it was buying, which was Lily telling Emma about the fund in terms she'd apparently reconstructed from Victoria's explanation, and Emma listening with complete seriousness, and then asking whether the cable tension gauge could be a metaphor for investment risk, which was not a sentence Ethan had expected to hear from a 6-year-old on a Saturday morning, but which, when he thought about it, was not entirely wrong. Victoria arrived Sunday at 2 to pick Lily up and stood in his kitchen doorway and looked at the scene. Both girls on the living room floor surrounded by an architecture of blankets and books, and the detritus of a weekend well used, Biscuit somehow having materialized overnight, despite the no-dog policy Ethan was apparently no longer enforcing. And her face did the thing it did sometimes, which was simply be there without a layer on it, open and tired and somewhere past the point where she was performing anything. "She's happy," Victoria said, quietly enough that only he could hear it. "Yeah," he said. "So is Emma." "I know." She looked at him then, and he looked back, and neither of them looked away. And there was nothing performed about it on either side, but just two people standing in the reality of what had been building since a concrete service corridor in September, finally letting it exist in the same room as them without calling it something it wasn't yet ready to be named. "I should get her home," Victoria said. "Okay." But neither of them moved for another moment. Outside, the January light was doing the flat pewter thing it did when the sky was deciding whether to snow. And inside the house, his daughter and her daughter were arguing cheerfully about blanket architecture, and Biscuit was asleep against the radiator like he'd never lived anywhere else. The formal review from Stratton-Weil's outside counsel came back clean on a Tuesday in February, which Victoria learned via a 2-line email from Richard Colm that said, essentially, what she had already known it would say. She read it, forwarded it to her legal team, and went back to the infrastructure fund deck she'd been building for a 5th limited partner presentation scheduled for the following week. She did not celebrate. She did not call anyone to announce it. She just kept working, because the review had been an interruption of the actual thing, and now the actual thing could continue. She told Ethan that evening, same way she'd told him about the conference room on LaSalle, plainly, without theater. "Clean," she said. "I know," he said. "You couldn't have known."
I knew there was nothing there. Same result. She shook her head even though he couldn't see it. You're very irritating when you're calm about things. You've mentioned that. I'm going to keep mentioning it. That's fine, he said, and she could hear the not quite smile in it, and she'd stopped pretending she didn't listen for that specifically.
They talked for a while longer about the fifth LP presentation, about a job he had the next morning on the north side, about the fact that Emma had apparently told Lily's teacher that Lily was her sister, which the teacher had relayed to Victoria at pickup with a gentle expression that suggested she didn't quite know what to do with the information. Lily had not corrected Emma. Lily had, according to the teacher, nodded seriously like this was accurate and moved on. "What do you want to do about that?" Victoria asked. "Nothing," Ethan said. "Emma knows the situation. She just decided sister was the right word." Lily didn't correct her. "No." "Lily corrects everything," Victoria said. "She corrected the museum placard. She corrected me twice this week about the counterweight percentage." "I know." A pause. "So she agreed with Emma," Victoria said. "Seems like it." Victoria sat with that for a moment in the quiet of her home office, the February dark outside the window, the house settled and warm around her. "Ethan," she said. "Yeah." "I don't know how to do this," she said. "Whatever this is becoming, I want to be honest about that. I know how to build things professionally. I know how to manage risk and construct arguments and run a meeting. I don't know how to—" She stopped. "I don't know how to be in something without immediately trying to manage it." He didn't respond right away. She had learned to wait for his responses instead of filling the space, which had been one of the harder adjustments she'd made since September, and also one of the more worthwhile ones. "I don't know how to be in something without checking it for structural failure," he said. "Every day. Same thing." "That sounds exhausting." "It is. Gets quieter over time. Doesn't stop." "How do you keep going anyway?" "The alternative is not going," he said. "That's not better." She breathed out. "No, it's not." "Victoria." "Yes." "I don't need you to know how to do this," he said. "I need you to be willing to be bad at it for a while." She thought about that for a long moment. "I'm very bad at being bad at things," she said. "I know." "You know that, and you're still—" "Yeah," he said, before she finished the sentence. She didn't say anything else for a moment. Outside her window, the February trees stood bare and black against the dark, and the city ran its constant low current underneath everything. And she sat in the middle of it and let the sentence he'd just said exist without immediately trying to categorize it. "Okay," she said. "Okay," he said. February moved into March. The way seasons moved in Chicago. Not cleanly, but in argument, cold days asserting themselves between warmer ones, until finally the warmth started winning more than it lost. Ethan noticed the shift the way he noticed most things, through what changed in the work. The number of freeze-related emergency calls dropped off. The spring contract cycle started early, building managers who'd spent winter deferring maintenance now clearing their backlogs before the summer construction rush hit. He and Danny picked up 4 new contracts in the second week of March, which meant they were busy in the useful way. Not scrambling, but fully occupied, the kind of workload that made the day go by with purpose. Danny had said nothing directly about Victoria since October, which was its own kind of commentary. What he had done was start occasionally mentioning, when scheduling jobs, that he could cover certain afternoon pickups or site checks if Ethan had something else going on, and he'd twice suggested they bring in a part-time third person for overflow, which was a conversation he had raised before but was now raising differently. Not as a business development suggestion, but as a practical accommodation for a life that seemed to have more in it than it had 6 months ago. Ethan had hired the part-time person in March, a young woman named Kezia, 24, who had a mechanical engineering associate's degree and the kind of natural aptitude for diagnostic work that couldn't be taught because it came from instinct more than knowledge. She was quick, and she didn't take shortcuts, and she asked the right questions. And by the end of her first 2 weeks, Danny had told Ethan, in the straightforward way Danny said things that mattered. "She's good. Don't mess it up by underpaying her." Ethan had given her a salary that made her look at the offer letter twice. He didn't think of it as an expansion. He thought of it as the business becoming what it had always been capable of being, which he'd been the only thing holding back, because holding back had felt safer than growing into something he might eventually not be able to control. He was working on that. It was slow going, but it was motion. The evening that shifted everything into a different shape happened in March, on a Friday, when both girls were at his house for what had become a standard Friday arrangement. Lily was spending more nights per week at Ethan's than at home by March, a fact that had developed organically and which Victoria had not fought because Lily slept better there and woke up easier and had stopped needing an hour of quiet in the morning before she could engage with the day. Victoria had come to pick Lily up at 7 and had found both girls asleep on the living room floor in the blanket structure that had now become a permanent installation that Ethan had stopped dismantling between visits because it took them 45 minutes to rebuild it every time, and they always rebuilt it the same way, so it was more efficient to leave it. Ethan was at the kitchen table with a job file and coffee. Victoria came into the kitchen and sat down across from him, and looked at him with the expression he'd come to recognize as the one she wore when she'd been thinking about something for a while, and had finally decided to say it. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Okay." "Not a business question, not a logistical question." She folded her hands on the table. "I've been trying to figure out how to ask it for about 3 weeks." He set his pen down. "Lily asked me something last night," Victoria said. "She asked me why she had a room at your house." Ethan was still. "She has the corner of Emma's room with the camping mattress and the reading lamp," Victoria said. "Emma moved her bookshelf to make space. Lily noticed it. She asked me what it meant." She met his eyes. "I didn't know what to tell her." He sat back in his chair slightly, outside the window. The March night was doing the particular thing March nights did in Chicago. Cold, but with a different quality to the cold. Less final, more like a door left open than a wall. "What did you want to tell her?" he said. Victoria was quiet for a moment. "I wanted to tell her that it meant she belonged somewhere," she said. "That there was a place where someone made room for her specifically, not managed space, not optimized environment." Her voice was steady, but not easy. "Real room. The kind where someone moves their bookshelf." He looked at her. "I didn't say that," Victoria continued, "because I didn't know if it was mine to say, if it was accurate from your side." She paused. "I told her I'd find out." "It's accurate," he said. She breathed in once, controlled. "I need to tell you something," he said, "and I need you to let me finish before you respond because I'm not fast at this and I'm going to do it wrong if I'm interrupted." "Okay," she said. He looked at his hands on the table for a moment. They were hands that had done a lot of things, had handled classified equipment in places he still couldn't name, had taken apart brake housings and cable systems for 4 years, had braided Emma's hair and checked her temperature and held her while she cried for a mother she was too young to have fully understood she had lost. "When Maya died," he said, "I made a decision. Not consciously. It wasn't the kind of thing you decide consciously, but I came home from the hospital that night and I stood in Emma's doorway, and I understood that I couldn't afford to want anything for myself anymore. Not because it was noble, but because I couldn't figure out how to protect Emma and also carry the weight of my own wanting." He paused. "So I stopped. Or I tried to. I built the routine and the system and the work, and I told myself that was enough. And most of the time I even believed it." Victoria was very still across the table. "And then a 6-year-old girl wandered into a service corridor," he said, "and talked to me about cable tension. And her mother showed up, and everything I'd been telling myself started to feel like, not a lie, exactly. More like a thing that had been true and had stopped being true without me noticing." He looked up at her. "I'm not good at this," he said. "I told you that in February. What I didn't tell you is that I want to be. That's different from where I've been for 4 years." He paused. "I'm not asking you to be something specific. I'm asking if you want to figure it out alongside me. Both of us being bad at it for a while. The kids in the same house on Fridays. You at my kitchen table when you need to think." He stopped. "I'm asking if this is something you want." The kitchen was very quiet. Victoria unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table, and he could see, because he was someone who noticed things, that they were not entirely steady. "Yes," she said. "That's what I want." He nodded. Not dramatically, just once, the way he acknowledged things that were true. "Okay," he said. "Okay," she said. And that was the conversation. No declarations, no ceremony. 2 people sitting at a kitchen table after the children were asleep, finally saying the thing they'd been saying sideways for 6 months, in the language of coffee cups and Saturday mornings and moved bookshelves. The Stratton Weil Infrastructure Fund held its fifth LP presentation in the second week of March and secured a commitment that brought the total to $340 million, which was not the largest fund Victoria had raised, but which mattered differently than the others, because she had built it on a thesis she believed in, had defended it against internal pressure without compromising its structure, and had done it while also being home for dinner 4 nights a week and spending Friday nights in a house in a neighborhood that didn't look anything like Lincoln Park. Richard Cullum called to congratulate her. "The review helped," he said. "Cleared the air." "There was no air to clear," she said. "But yes." "You've seemed different this year," Richard said. "I don't mean that negatively." "How do you mean it?" "Less pressurized," he said. "Like you're still running hard, but you've chosen the direction instead of just running." She thought about that for a moment. "I have a better idea of what I'm running toward," she said. Richard seemed to find this sufficient and moved on to other things. And after the call, she sat at her desk and looked out at the Chicago March skyline and thought about a cable tension gauge being turned over in small, careful hands, and about the way Lily had asked what it meant that she had a room in someone else's house, and about the answer she'd gone home and given, that it meant someone had made space for her because they wanted her there, not because it was the right developmental strategy, not because the research supported it, because they wanted her there. Lily had considered this. "Like how Emma moved this bookshelf," she said. "Yes," Victoria said, "exactly like that." Lily had nodded, with the nod that meant a thing had been filed accurately and gone back to whatever she'd been reading. And Victoria had stood in her daughter's doorway and watched her, and felt something that she didn't have a precise word for. Not happiness exactly, because happiness was too simple and too surface for it. Something more like the sensation of a structure settling, of weight being distributed the way it was supposed to be distributed, so that what had felt precarious for a long time finally felt like it would hold. April. Emma's school did a project in April where each student was asked to describe their family. Emma came home on a Thursday and told Ethan about it with the focused energy she brought to anything that was both personally significant and slightly complicated. "I put you and me," she said, "and then I put Lily and Victoria." Ethan was making dinner. He kept his hands on what he was doing. "What did your teacher say?" She asked if Lily and Victoria were relatives. Emma climbed onto her kitchen chair with the athletic ease of a child who treated furniture as terrain. "I said not yet." He turned and looked at her. Emma looked back at him with Maya's look, the head tilted sideways, deciding whether to trust something look. "Is that okay?" she said. He turned back to the stove. "Yeah," he said, that's okay." Emma picked up her fork and waited for dinner. "Lily said the same thing when her teacher asked," she said, in the tone of someone reporting a fact that confirmed a hypothesis. "What did Lily say?" "Not yet." He kept his back to her for a moment because he needed the moment. "They must coordinate," he said, which was what Victoria had said in February. And Emma laughed the way she laughed when she caught a reference she recognized, bright and quick, and the kitchen smelled like garlic, and the radiator ticked against the wall. And outside, the April evening was finally, genuinely warm. Lily's second session with a new therapist, a woman named Dr. Anaya Marsh, who had been recommended by Lily's school counselor and who Victoria had almost not called because she was tired of the cycle of hoping and adjusting and starting over. That second session ended with Dr. Marsh coming into the waiting room with a calm expression and telling Victoria that Lily had spent 40 minutes talking about elevator mechanics, cable tension, and a dog named Biscuit, and that she was quite possibly the most verbally sophisticated 6-year-old she had worked with, and that she thought they could do good work together. Victoria called Ethan from the parking lot. "She talked for 40 minutes, she said. "About what?" "Elevators, Biscuit, counterweights." A pause. "You, mostly, in the way that kids talk about someone who's become part of how they understand things." He was quiet. "Dr. Marsh said she's sophisticated," Victoria said. "She said it the way people say it when they mean it, and not just as a reassurance." "She is," he said. "She was always going to be. She just needed to trust that the room was safe enough." "Ethan." "Yeah." "Thank you," she said. I know you're going to say you didn't do anything. I was going to say I sat on a dirty floor. That's what I'm thanking you for." He didn't answer for a moment. She could hear his breathing and the sound of whatever street he was on,
and the ordinary noise of the city around him. "Come to dinner tonight," he said. "Both of you. Emma's been asking about the cable tension gauge project she wants to do with Lily, and I'm not going to be able to explain to her why we're waiting much longer." "What cable tension gauge project?" "I don't know yet. She described it for 20 minutes on Wednesday, and I followed about half of it." Victoria was laughing before she could decide whether to. Real laughing, in a parking lot outside a therapist's office in April, with the warm air moving through her open car window. "Okay," she said. "We'll be there at 6. I'll make enough food." "You always make enough food." "Because you always stay longer than you plan to." She stopped laughing but kept smiling. "Is that a complaint?" "No," he said. "It's just true." They came at 6 and stayed until 9:30, which was longer than planned, which was usual. The cable tension gauge project turned out to involve a rope, 2 kitchen chairs, a postal scale that Emma had apparently located in the back of a closet, and a theory about load distribution that Lily had apparently been developing for 2 weeks, based on what she remembered from the service corridor in the museum and every subsequent conversation in which Ethan had mentioned anything structural. The theory was mostly right. Ethan sat on the kitchen floor and watched them test it, offering corrections when asked and staying quiet when not. And Victoria sat at the table with her coffee and watched all 3 of them, and the evening had the quality that good evenings had. Not perfect, just full, with the texture of real things in it. Emma argued with Lily about the chair placement. Lily overruled her using math that Emma couldn't immediately counter. Emma appealed to Ethan. Ethan said Lily was right. Emma accepted this with a dramatic sigh and moved the chair. "You always take her side," Emma said. "I take the side that's correct," he said. "Lily's side is always correct." "Then I always take the correct side." Emma considered this, decided it was technically true, and went back to the experiment. Lily caught Victoria's eye from across the room and gave her a look that was fully aware of what had just happened. The look of a child who understood the dynamics of the room she was in and found them satisfactory. Victoria raised her coffee mug slightly, like a small toast, and Lily's mouth pulled up at one corner and she turned back to the rope and the postal scale in the kitchen chair. After the girls were in bed, Emma in her room, Lily on the camping mattress under the reading lamp that had become hers in everything but official designation, Ethan and Victoria sat at the kitchen table with the last of the coffee and the quiet of a house that had children sleeping in it, which was a particular kind of quiet, weighted, and warm. "I've been thinking about something," Victoria said. "Okay." "The Lincoln Park house is large for 2 people, she said. "It made sense when I bought it. I was building a life that was going to have more in it, I thought. And then it was just Lily and me, and it was too large, and I stopped noticing because I was working." She turned her coffee mug slightly. "I've been thinking about whether it makes sense to stay there." He looked at her. "I'm not saying anything specific," she said. "I'm saying I've been thinking about it." "Where have you been thinking about moving to?" She met his eyes. "This neighborhood, maybe." He held her gaze. "It's a good neighborhood," he said. "I know. You've mentioned it." Emma would have opinions about the specific house. I would expect nothing less. Lily would want to be within Biscuit walking distance of this block. Biscuit has somehow become our dog despite never living with us, so that's appropriate. He looked at his coffee. "You don't have to figure it out tonight," he said. "I know. But when you're ready to look, I know which blocks are better." She nodded slowly. "Because you know this neighborhood. Because I've been here 4 years, and I know which streets the city plows first, and which landlords actually fix things, and where Emma is allowed to ride her bike unsupervised, and where she isn't." Victoria looked at him for a long moment, at the hands on the table and the face that was 37 years old, and had been through things she knew only in outline and which had made him into something specific and hard to describe. Not hard, not damaged, just formed. Shaped by what had happened to him in the way that people were shaped when they didn't let the hard things make them smaller. "You're a good father," she said. He looked up. "I'm not saying it to be nice," she said. "I mean it as a precise observation. Emma is who she is because of how you've been with her. That's a real thing you've done." He was quiet for a moment. "I've made mistakes," he said. "I know. I'm not saying you're perfect. I'm saying you're good." She held his gaze. "There's a difference. You know that." He did know that. He'd spent enough time working on break housings that had been installed by people who thought good enough was the same as correct to know that the difference between good and perfect wasn't perfectionism, it was honesty. The willingness to check your work and acknowledge what needed adjusting and keep going. "You're a good mother," he said. Same terms, not perfect, good. She didn't deflect it or argue with it, which was new. She took it in and nodded once, and he could see that she was genuinely receiving it rather than waiting for the right moment to redirect. "We're both getting better at it," she said. "Yeah. Together, apparently." "Apparently." She smiled at that, real, unguarded, the smile he'd first seen in Reardon's diner in October when he'd said something about the exhaustion of her professional timeline and she'd laughed at herself for the first time in front of him. The thing about Ethan Cross was that he had spent a significant portion of his adult life in situations where everything depended on reading the variables correctly and acting on what was actually there rather than what he wished was there or feared was there. That discipline, the discipline of seeing clearly, was the thing the military had taken a natural tendency and sharpened into something reliable. And what he saw, sitting at his kitchen table on an April night with Victoria Ashford across from him and both their daughters asleep down the hall, was not a complicated situation requiring careful analysis. It was straightforward. It was two people and two children who had found each other through a concrete service corridor and a cable tension gauge, and a series of Saturday mornings and difficult conversations, and had built something real out of those materials. Not perfect, not smooth, real, with all the friction and weight and occasional wrong note that real things had. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. She looked at it. Then she looked at him. She turned her hand over, palm up, and held on. What happened after that happened the way most real things happened. Not all at once, but incrementally, in the language of small decisions that accumulated into something large. Victoria found a house 4 streets from Ethan's in June, a 3-bedroom with a yard that Biscuit could theoretically access without requiring a diplomatic arrangement between households. And Emma did have opinions about the specific house, and 2 of those opinions were incorporated into the final decision, which Victoria considered a reasonable outcome. Lily picked her room based entirely on which window had the best light for reading, and spent the first weekend repainting it with Victoria's help in a color that was described on the paint chip as coastal fog, but which was actually just gray, and which looked exactly right. Danny was told directly, because Ethan was not the kind of person to let a friend of 11 years find out something significant through the natural circulation of information. And Danny's response was to say, "Finally," in a tone that communicated the entire preceding 6 months of professional restraint being released in a single word. Keziah, who had been with the company for 3 months, turned out to be exactly the person Danny had assessed her as, and by summer the 3 of them were running a volume of work that would have been impossible for 2. Ethan had resisted this expansion for 4 years on the basis that growth meant losing control, and what he discovered in the having of it was that the right people didn't reduce control. They distributed it, which was not the same thing. He should have known that. He'd led a team once that had operated in the most chaotic conditions imaginable and had succeeded because every person in it understood the objective and could be trusted to work toward it without being managed at every step. The infrastructure fund closed at $420 million by September, 2 months ahead of the timeline Victoria had projected. The 5th LP had brought in 2 more, and the investment committee had developed into something she was proud of. People who understood the thesis and were committed to the time horizon, and who had been selected not for their names but for their patience, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. She presented the final close numbers in a room full of people who had believed in it, and she did not cry, because she did not cry in professional settings. But afterwards she sat in her car and took 3 minutes before driving home, and that was the closest she came. Lily started 2nd grade in September, and on the first day, when the teacher asked students to introduce themselves and say one thing they were interested in, Lily said, "My name is Lily. I'm interested in mechanical systems and load distribution." The teacher, a patient woman named Ms. Okafor, had written this down and later told Victoria at pickup that Lily was remarkable and that she was very glad to have her. Victoria told Ethan that evening. "Load distribution," he said. "Apparently. She's going to be an engineer." "She's going to be whatever she decides," Victoria said. "But yes, probably an engineer." Emma, for her part, had decided that she was going to be either an architect or a mechanic, and had asked Ethan to explain the practical differences, and he had explained them honestly, and Emma had said she'd decide later, which was a reasonable position for a 6-year-old. There was an evening in October, a year, almost exactly, from the coffee at Reardon's, when Ethan was sitting on the back steps of his house in the early dark of the autumn evening, and Victoria came out and sat beside him, and they could hear through the kitchen door Emma and Lily doing something that involved significant disagreement and then laughter, the pattern they always fell into. Lily told Dr. Marsh she feels safe, Victoria said. He looked at the yard. She said, apparently in the middle of a session about something else, that she feels safe when she's in this house. Victoria's voice was level but not effortless. Dr. Marsh told me because she thought I'd want to know. Did it help to hear it? Yes and no, she said. Yes, because it's true and I can see it. No, because... She paused. Because I spent a year and a half building the perfect controlled environment and it didn't get me there. And a man sat on a concrete floor and talked about cable tension and got there in 20 minutes. That's not what happened, he said. I know it's not that simple. No. I mean, you're the reason she felt safe enough to walk into a corridor by herself. You're the reason she knew the world was basically navigable, that if she needed quiet, she could find it. She trusted that the building was safe enough to explore because you built that foundation. He looked at her. I just happened to be in the corridor. Victoria was quiet. You were in the corridor, she said. So were you, 2 minutes later. That's generous. It's accurate, he said, same terms we always use. She leaned against him. Not dramatically, just shifted her weight so that her shoulder was against his arm, the uncomplicated physical shorthand of two people who had gotten past the point of performing proximity. He didn't move. He just let it be what it was. The yard was dark beyond the reach of the kitchen light, and the October air had the specific quality that October air had in this city, carrying the smell of leaves and cold, and the particular note that meant winter was coming and was not going to apologize for it. He'd lived through 5 Chicago winters in this house, and they had all been hard and all been manageable, and he had come out the other side of each one with everything that mattered still intact. That was not nothing. He knew that better than most people, that intact was not a small thing. Intact was the thing. The kitchen door opened and Emma appeared holding a piece of paper. Lily says I miscalculated the load distribution for the rope experiment, Emma said, with the air of someone bringing a formal grievance. Did she show you the math? Ethan said. Emma's expression shifted slightly. Yes. Was she right? A pause. Mostly, Emma said. Mostly right or right? A longer pause. Right, Emma said. Okay. Emma looked at them both for a moment, at her father on the steps and at Victoria beside him, with the assessing look she'd had since she was old enough to notice the world arranging itself around her. Are you coming in soon? She said. Yeah, Ethan said. Give us a few minutes. Emma nodded and went back inside, and they heard her say to Lily, in the kitchen, Fine, you were right, but only because Ethan said so. And Lily's response, I was right before Ethan said so. And Emma, that's not how being right works. And Lily, yes it is. And the sound of the argument cycling back into something that would eventually become laughter, the way all their arguments did. Ethan felt Victoria's shoulders move against him. She was laughing quietly, contained, her whole body in on it. They're going to argue like that forever, she said. Yeah, he said. Probably. Is that okay with you? He looked out at the October yard and at the kitchen light falling through the door. And he thought about a service corridor on a Tuesday in September, and a cable tension gauge turned over in small, careful hands, and a concrete floor, and the particular shape that a life took when you stopped trying to control its outline and just did the next true thing. Yeah, he said. That's okay with me. They sat there a while longer, the two of them, while inside the house the girls argued about math with the cheerful ferocity of people who were completely comfortable disagreeing with each other, which was its own kind of love. The kind that didn't require agreement, only presence, only the willingness to stay in the room and keep talking. That was what it came down to finally, not the billion-dollar fund, or the classified missions, or the controlled environments, or the perfect approaches. Not the grief managed correctly, or the career built without compromise, or the developmental strategies applied with precision. What it came down to was a concrete floor and enough quiet to let someone speak, and the understanding, hard won, differently arrived at, but shared,
That the people worth keeping were the ones who showed up and stayed and didn't make you perform anything to earn the right to the room. Both of them had taken a long time to understand that. Both of them were, finally,